The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Thomas Fletcher adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be the last time. 23 years of faithful service to the crown had led him to this moment, standing in the shadows of the East Terrace, clutching a manila envelope that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Thomas had always been the perfect royal guard. Born in a small Yorkshire village, he had dreamed since childhood of serving the royal family. His father, a former soldier, had instilled in him values of honor, duty, and unwavering loyalty. When Thomas finally earned his position within the elite protection unit, it felt like destiny fulfilled. He had protected 3 generations of royals, witnessed countless state occasions, and kept secrets that would never see the light of day. But everything changed 3 months ago on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Thomas had been assigned to the night shift at Clarence House, Queen Camilla's official residence. It was supposed to be routine: patrol the corridors, monitor the security feeds, ensure the Queen Consort's safety while she worked late in her private study. The other guards respected Thomas for his professionalism and discretion. He never gossiped about what he saw or heard, never shared stories in the staff quarters like some of the younger guards did. That night, Queen Camilla was hosting what appeared to be a private meeting. Thomas had been instructed to maintain a perimeter but not to approach the study unless summoned. He positioned himself in the hallway, just close enough to respond to any emergency but far enough to respect privacy. The Queen's visitors had arrived separately through different entrances, a precaution Thomas had seen before for sensitive diplomatic meetings. The first to arrive was Sir Marcus Thornfield, a man Thomas recognized as a prominent businessman with connections to several charitable organizations the Queen supported. Thornfield was known for his philanthropy, particularly his work with veterans' charities. He had been photographed with the royal family on numerous occasions, always smiling, always perfectly groomed, always saying the right things to the press. 20 minutes later, a woman Thomas didn't immediately recognize entered through the garden entrance. She was elegantly dressed, perhaps in her 50s, with an air of quiet authority. Thomas later learned she was Victoria Ashworth, CEO of Meridian Holdings, a company he had never heard of but which apparently had significant government contracts. The third visitor puzzled Thomas the most. Dr. Eleanor Sinclair arrived in a modest sedan rather than the luxury vehicles typically used by the Queen's associates. Thomas knew Dr. Sinclair by reputation. She was a respected historian and academic who had occasionally advised the royal family on matters of historical protocol and tradition. Her presence at what seemed to be a business meeting struck him as unusual. For the first hour, Thomas heard nothing but the typical murmur of conversation that filtered through the heavy oak doors of the study. He made his regular patrols, checked the security monitors, and maintained radio contact with the other guards positioned throughout the residence. Everything seemed normal, professional, routine. Then, the voices grew louder. Thomas had trained himself over the years to ignore private conversations, to let the words wash over him without registering their meaning. It was part of being a good guard, seeing without watching, hearing without listening. But, on this night, something in the tone of the voices made him pause near the study door. The documentation must be absolutely secure, Queen Camilla's voice carried through the door with unusual sharpness. If any of this comes to light before we're ready, it will destroy everything we've worked for. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He had never heard the Queen speak with such intensity, such barely controlled emotion. He tried to continue his patrol, to dismiss what he had heard, but his feet seemed rooted to the corridor carpet. Sir Marcus Thornfield's voice responded, equally tense, "Your Majesty, the offshore accounts are completely untraceable. The charities provide perfect cover for the transfers. No one suspects that the money is being redirected." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Offshore accounts? Redirected money? These were not terms he expected to hear in any conversation involving the Queen Consort. He knew he should move away, should pretend he had heard nothing, but something compelled him to stay. Dr. Sinclair's voice joined the conversation, her academic tone now sharp with worry. "The historical precedent is clear, Your Majesty. When royal involvement in financial irregularities has been exposed in the past, the consequences have been catastrophic for the monarchy's reputation. We're walking a very dangerous line." "The monarchy has survived worse scandals," Victoria Ashworth interjected. "And the cause is worth the risk. The displaced families in the Commonwealth territories need this support," even if we have to obtain it through unconventional means. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, his mind reeling. The Queen Consort was discussing financial irregularities, offshore accounts, and unconventional means of obtaining money. His 23 years of service had taught him to trust the royal family implicitly, to believe that they always acted in the best interests of the nation and the Commonwealth. But what he was hearing challenged everything he believed. The problem, Queen Camilla continued, is ensuring that the funds reach the intended recipients without passing through official channels. The government's bureaucracy would tie this up for years while people continue to suffer. Thomas began to understand the complexity of what he was overhearing. It seemed the Queen was involved in some kind of unauthorized financial operation, but the motivation appeared to be humanitarian rather than personal gain. The moral ambiguity of the situation made his head spin. Sir Marcus spoke again. The next transfer is scheduled for tomorrow night. £2 million will be moved from the Veterans Charity account to the Meridian Holdings subsidiary, then redirected to the Relief Fund. By the time anyone notices the irregularity, the money will already be helping families rebuild their lives. And if we're caught? Dr. Sinclair asked. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat in the quiet corridor. Finally, Queen Camilla spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. Then, we face the consequences. But I refuse to stand by while bureaucratic red tape prevents us from helping people in desperate need. Sometimes doing the right thing requires taking risks. Thomas slowly backed away from the door, his mind struggling to process what he had learned. The Queen Consort was apparently involved in moving money through unofficial channels to help displaced families in Commonwealth territories. The operation involved fake charity accounts, offshore transfers, and deliberate circumvention of government oversight. As a loyal guard, Thomas knew his duty was to protect the royal family, not to question their actions. But, as a citizen who had sworn an oath to uphold the law, he faced an unprecedented moral dilemma. Was the Queen breaking the law for humanitarian reasons, or was there something more sinister at play? Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself inadvertently observing more meetings, overhearing more conversations, and piecing together more details about the operation. He learned that the scheme had been running for over 2 years, that millions of pounds had been redirected, and that the network involved dozens of charitable organizations, offshore companies, and private individuals. The more he learned, the more conflicted he became. The Queen's intentions appeared to be genuine. She was frustrated by the slow pace of official aid to Commonwealth territories affected by natural disasters, political instability, and economic collapse. The unofficial network she had helped establish was providing rapid, direct assistance to families who might otherwise wait years for help through official channels. But Thomas also recognized that what the Queen was doing was illegal. Charitable fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, the potential charges were serious and numerous. If exposed, the scandal would not only destroy Queen Camilla personally but could destabilize the entire monarchy at a time when public support for the royal family was already fragile. Thomas began documenting what he observed. Initially, he told himself it was just to organize his own thoughts, to understand the full scope of what was happening. But, as the evidence accumulated, he realized he was creating a comprehensive record of royal wrongdoing. The manila envelope now contained photographs of documents, recordings of conversations, detailed timelines of meetings, and financial records he had copied during his security rounds. It was enough evidence to prove that Queen Camilla had established and was operating an extensive illegal financial network. The question that haunted Thomas was what to do with this information. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, but his duty to the law was equally clear. Could he expose the Queen's illegal activities, even if they were motivated by humanitarian concerns? Could he destroy a woman who was genuinely trying to help people, even if her methods were wrong? As Thomas stood in the morning mist, watching the first tourists arrive at the castle gates, he realized that his decision would affect far more than just his own conscience. The evidence in his hands could trigger a constitutional crisis, potentially ending the reign of King Charles III before it had truly begun. It could destroy public trust in the monarchy at a time when the institution was still recovering from previous scandals. But Thomas also knew that allowing the illegal activity to continue made him complicit in the wrongdoing. His silence enabled the Queen's crimes, regardless of her motivations. The oath he had sworn as a guard included a promise to uphold the law, not just to protect individuals. The envelope felt heavier with each passing moment. Inside were the documents that would force him to choose between his loyalty to the crown and his duty to justice. Whatever he decided would define not only his own legacy but, potentially, the future of the British monarchy itself. Thomas Fletcher had spent his entire adult life serving the royal family without question, but now he faced a question that would test everything he believed about honor, duty, and the difference between legal and moral obligations. The perfect guard was about to discover that perfection sometimes required making the most imperfect choices. As he walked back toward the castle, Thomas knew that by evening, he would have to decide whether to remain silent or to speak the truth that could change everything. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did at that moment, pressing down on the shoulders of a man who had never asked for such responsibility but now found himself holding the future of the monarchy in his hands. The morning mist began to clear, and, with it, Thomas Fletcher's illusions about the simple nature of loyalty and duty. The real world was more complicated than he had ever imagined, and the choices ahead were more difficult than any he had faced in 23 years of faithful service. But one thing was certain: by the end of the day, nothing would ever be the same again. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews had seen many unusual cases during her 15 years with the Metropolitan Police, but she never expected to find herself sitting across from a royal guard who claimed to have evidence of criminal activity involving Queen Camilla. The small interview room at Scotland Yard felt cramped and stuffy as she studied Thomas Fletcher's face, looking for any signs of delusion, malice, or attention-seeking behavior. Thomas sat rigidly upright, his hands folded precisely on the table before him. Even in civilian clothes, he maintained the bearing of a man accustomed to military discipline. His eyes, however, betrayed the internal struggle that had brought him to this moment. Sarah had interviewed enough witnesses over the years to recognize genuine distress, and Thomas Fletcher was clearly a man in agony. "Mr. Fletcher," Sarah began carefully, "I need you to understand the gravity of what you're alleging. You're claiming that Her Majesty Queen Camilla is involved in financial crimes. Do you realize the implications of making such accusations?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand, Inspector. I've thought of nothing else for weeks. But I swore an oath to uphold the law, and I believe the law applies to everyone, regardless of their position." Sarah opened the manila envelope Thomas had provided and began examining its contents. The documents appeared authentic photocopies of financial records, printed emails, handwritten notes in what Thomas claimed was the Queen's distinctive handwriting. There were also several small digital recording devices, which Thomas explained contained audio from the meetings he had observed. "How did you obtain these recordings?" Sarah asked. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Part of my security duties involved monitoring electronic devices in the residence. The recording equipment is standard for security purposes, but typically the recordings are only reviewed if there's a security incident. I began keeping copies of recordings that contained the conversations I'm reporting." Sarah made a note. Thomas had potentially violated his employment terms and possibly broken privacy laws to gather this evidence, but if the allegations were true, the public interest might justify his actions. The legal complexities were already giving her a headache. "Let's start with the first incident you witnessed," Sarah said, activating her own recording device. "Walk me through exactly what you saw and heard." Thomas recounted the October meeting in careful detail, his training evident in the precision of his observations. He provided exact times, described the participants, and repeated conversations with remarkable accuracy. Sarah found herself believing his account despite her instinctive skepticism about such extraordinary claims. "And you believe this was the first meeting of this nature?" she asked. "No, Inspector. As I continued to pay attention, I realized similar meetings had been occurring regularly for months, possibly years. I had simply never focused on the content of the conversations before." Sarah studied the financial documents more closely. They appeared to show money moving between various charitable organizations, offshore companies, and private accounts in a complex web of transfers. The amounts were substantial. Individual transfers ranged from hundreds of thousands to several million pounds. "Tell me about Sir Marcus Thornfield," Sarah said. Thomas straightened slightly. "Sir Marcus is well known in royal circles. He's been involved with veterans' charities for over a decade, has received honors for his philanthropic work. He's photographed regularly at royal events and has been a guest at state dinners. His reputation is impeccable. And Victoria Ashworth? I knew less about her initially, but I did some research after the first meeting. Meridian Holdings is her company. They have government contracts for infrastructure projects in several Commonwealth territories. The company has a clean public record, no obvious red flags. Sarah made more notes. If Thomas was correct, the Queen had recruited individuals with legitimate public reputations to operate an illegal financial network. The sophistication suggested careful planning and execution over an extended period. Dr. Eleanor Sinclair? Sarah continued. She's an academic, a historian specializing in constitutional and royal history. She's advised the royal family on protocol matters for years. I think her role in this operation was to help understand the legal and historical implications of what they were doing. The recording devices contained hours of conversations spanning several months. Sarah knew it would take her team weeks to analyze all the material, but even the samples she reviewed during the interview supported Thomas's account. The voices were clear, the content damning, and the implications staggering. Mr. Fletcher, what motivated you to come forward? Sarah asked. You could have simply requested a transfer to different duties and avoided this entire situation. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Inspector, I've served the royal family my entire adult life. I've protected them with my life, kept their secrets, respected their privacy. But what I witnessed wasn't a private matter, it was criminal activity that affects public funds, charitable donations, and vulnerable people who depend on legitimate aid. Sarah noticed that Thomas didn't mention any personal grievances or complaints about his treatment by the royal household. This wasn't a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, it was a man whose moral compass had forced him to make an impossible choice. The Queen appeared to believe she was helping people, Thomas continued. And maybe she was, in some cases. But she was also breaking the law, potentially stealing money from legitimate charities, and creating a system that could be exploited by others with less noble intentions. After the interview, Sarah briefed her superior, Chief Inspector David Morrison, who immediately escalated the matter to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Within hours, the case had reached the highest levels of law enforcement and government. The potential political and constitutional implications meant that every decision would be scrutinized by multiple agencies and departments. Sarah was assigned to lead a small, carefully selected team to investigate Thomas's allegations. The investigation would need to be conducted with absolute discretion while maintaining professional standards that would withstand scrutiny if the case eventually went to court. The team began by verifying Thomas's access and opportunity to gather the evidence he provided. His security clearance records confirmed that he had legitimate access to the areas where the meetings occurred. His service record showed no disciplinary actions, no financial problems, and no obvious motivations for fabricating such serious allegations. Next, they began the painstaking process of tracing the financial transactions Thomas had documented. This required cooperation from bank officials, charity regulators, and international financial authorities. Each request had to be carefully worded to avoid revealing the identity of the target of their investigation. Detective Sergeant Michael Chen, Sarah's most trusted colleague, was assigned to research the background of the other individuals involved in the alleged scheme. Sir Marcus Thornfield's charitable work appeared legitimate on the surface, but closer examination revealed some unusual patterns in the way funds were managed and distributed. The timing is suspicious, Michael reported during one of their daily briefings. Large donations to Thornfield's veteran charity consistently arrive just days before substantial transfers to other organizations. It's as if the charity is being used as a temporary holding account rather than for its stated purpose. Victoria Ashworth's company, Meridian Holdings, proved more difficult to investigate. The company's government contracts were classified at various levels, making it challenging to trace the flow of public money. However, financial records showed that Meridian regularly transferred funds to humanitarian organizations operating in the same Commonwealth territories where the company had infrastructure projects. Dr. Eleanor Sinclair's involvement puzzled the investigators initially. Her role appeared to be advisory rather than operational, but her expertise in constitutional law and royal history suggested she understood the full implications of the scheme. Sarah suspected that Dr. Sinclair's participation indicated the conspirators were aware they were breaking the law and wanted guidance on managing the risks. As the investigation progressed, the evidence supporting Thomas's allegations continued to mount. Bank records confirmed the transfer patterns he had described. Audio analysis verified that the voices on his recordings matched known samples of the Queen's speech. Handwriting experts confirmed that notes in the evidence matched the Queen's distinctive style. But the investigators also uncovered evidence that complicated the narrative. The money being redirected appeared to be reaching legitimate humanitarian causes. Families displaced by natural disasters in Caribbean territories had received direct financial assistance that enabled them to rebuild their lives. Veterans in African Commonwealth nations had received medical treatment and housing support that wasn't available through official channels. This isn't a simple fraud case, Sarah told her team during a briefing 3 weeks into the investigation. The Queen and her associates appear to be genuinely trying to help people, but they're using illegal methods to do it. The question we need to answer is whether the humanitarian outcomes justify the criminal means. The legal complexities were unprecedented. Crown immunity traditionally protected the sovereign from prosecution, but Queen Camilla was the queen consort, not the reigning monarch. Legal scholars disagreed about whether crown immunity applied to her actions, especially if those actions were personal rather than official. Constitutional experts were equally divided about the implications of prosecuting a member of the royal family for financial crimes. Some argued that the rule of law required equal treatment regardless of social position. Others contended that prosecuting the queen consort could destabilize the monarchy and potentially trigger a constitutional crisis. Sarah found herself caught between her duty as a police officer and the broader implications of her investigation. The evidence clearly supported criminal charges against Queen Camilla and her associates. But pursuing those charges could have consequences far beyond the courtroom. "We're not just investigating a crime," Chief Inspector Morrison reminded her team. "We're potentially reshaping the relationship between the monarchy and the law. Whatever we do will set precedents that will affect the royal family for generations." Meanwhile, Thomas Fletcher remained under protective supervision. His identity as the source of the allegations was known to only a few senior officials, but there were concerns about his safety and well-being. The stress of his decision was evident in his increasingly gaunt appearance and the tremor that had developed in his hands. "Do you regret coming forward?" Sarah asked during one of their follow-up interviews. Thomas considered the question carefully. "I regret the necessity of it, Inspector. I regret that the Queen put me in a position where I had to choose between my loyalty to her personally and my duty to the law. But I don't regret the decision itself. Some principles are more important than personal comfort." As the investigation entered its second month, pressure was building from multiple directions. Government officials wanted regular briefings on the progress of the case. Legal experts demanded access to the evidence to assess the constitutional implications. Security services were concerned about potential leaks that could compromise ongoing operations. Sarah realized that her investigation was approaching a point where decisions would need to be made about whether to pursue formal charges. The evidence was strong enough to support prosecution, but the political and constitutional ramifications made every choice fraught with danger. The case had evolved far beyond a simple criminal investigation. It had become a test of whether the rule of law truly applied equally to all citizens, including those at the highest levels of society. The decisions made in the coming weeks would define not only the fate of Queen Camilla but the future relationship between the monarchy and the law. Sarah Matthews had joined the police force to pursue justice and protect the public, but she never imagined she would find herself at the center of a case that could reshape the constitutional foundations of the nation. The weight of that responsibility grew heavier with each passing day, as did the evidence against one of the most prominent members of the royal family. The investigation was far from over, but Sarah knew that the most difficult decisions still lay ahead. The secure meeting room deep within Buckingham Palace had witnessed countless sensitive discussions over the decades, but none quite like this one. King Charles III sat at the head of the mahogany table, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Around him sat the most senior members of his household and government officials whose discretion was absolute. Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton spoke in carefully measured tones as he briefed the king on the investigation that threatened to engulf the monarchy. Your Majesty, our contacts within the Metropolitan Police have confirmed that the investigation into Her Majesty Queen Camilla's activities is proceeding with full support from the highest levels of government. Charles rubbed his temples, a gesture that betrayed the strain he was under. 6 months into his reign, he was facing a crisis that could destabilize everything he had worked toward throughout his long preparation for kingship. What exactly do they believe they have evidence of? Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sir Clive consulted his notes. Financial fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The allegations center around an unauthorized network for distributing funds to humanitarian causes in Commonwealth territories. The scale appears to be substantial, potentially tens of millions of pounds over several years. The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Lord Chamberlain Andrew Parker, responsible for the royal household's daily operations, finally spoke. Your Majesty, we need to consider the possibility that these allegations are accurate. Her Majesty has always been passionate about humanitarian causes, particularly in the Commonwealth. It's conceivable that her frustration with bureaucratic delays led her to pursue alternative methods of providing aid. Charles looked up sharply. The suggestion that his wife might actually be guilty of the alleged crimes was almost too painful to contemplate, but he was a realist who understood that hope alone wouldn't resolve this crisis. Has anyone spoken directly with Her Majesty about these allegations? Charles asked. I attempted to approach the subject delicately yesterday, Sir Clive replied. Her Majesty became quite defensive and insisted that any actions she might have taken were motivated solely by the urgent need to help vulnerable people. She didn't deny the substance of the allegations, but she refused to discuss specifics. The King's Communications Secretary, Tobias Elwood, leaned forward with obvious concern. Your Majesty, we need to prepare for multiple scenarios. If formal charges are filed, the constitutional implications are unprecedented. The public reaction could be devastating for the monarchy's reputation. Charles had spent his entire life preparing for the throne, studying constitutional law and royal history. He understood better than anyone the delicate balance that allowed the monarchy to survive in a modern democratic society. Public trust was the foundation of that survival, and scandals involving criminal activity could destroy the trust irreparably. What legal protections apply to the Queen Consort? Charles asked. Sir Clive consulted another document. The legal experts are divided, Your Majesty. Crown immunity clearly protects you as the sovereign, but the Queen Consort's position is less certain. Some argue that her actions were personal rather than official, which would remove any immunity. Others contend that her humanitarian work was conducted in her official capacity as a member of the royal family. Andrew Parker added grimly, even if legal immunity applies, the political reality is that the government cannot be seen to be protecting royal criminals. The public backlash would be catastrophic for both the monarchy and the government. The king rose and walked to one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. Outside, tourists gathered at the gates, taking photographs and hoping for a glimpse of royal life. The ordinary people of Britain still supported the monarchy, but Charles knew that support was conditional on the royal family maintaining moral authority and staying above reproach. What options do we have? Charles asked without turning from the window. Tobias cleared his throat nervously. Your Majesty, we see several possible paths forward. First, we could attempt to negotiate with the authorities, perhaps agree to full cooperation and restitution in exchange for avoiding criminal charges. Second, we could prepare a comprehensive legal defense arguing that the Queen's actions, while technically illegal, were motivated by humanitarian concerns that should mitigate any punishment. Third, we could consider the possibility of the Queen stepping back from royal duties while the matter is resolved. The third option hung in the air like a sword. For Queen Camilla to withdraw from public life would be tantamount to an admission of guilt and would devastate her personally. But it might be necessary to protect the broader monarchy. There's a fourth option, Sir Clive said quietly. Her Majesty could make a full confession, take complete responsibility for any wrongdoing, and voluntarily submit to legal consequences. Such an approach might actually strengthen public respect for the monarchy by demonstrating that the royal family isn't above the law. Charles turned back to face the room. And what would that mean in practical terms? Potentially criminal prosecution, conviction, and imprisonment, Sir Clive replied bluntly. The Queen Consort could face several years in prison if convicted on all charges. The thought of his wife in prison was almost unbearable for Charles to contemplate. But he also recognized that his personal feelings could not be the primary consideration when the future of the monarchy was at stake. Lord Chamberlain Parker spoke up again. Your Majesty, we also need to consider the impact on royal patronages and charitable work. The Queen is patron to dozens of organizations. If these allegations become public, the damage to those charities could be substantial. Charles had not considered this aspect of the crisis. Camilla's patronages included causes close to her heart: literacy programs, domestic violence shelters, animal welfare organizations. The scandal could destroy funding and public support for countless worthy causes that had nothing to do with the alleged financial crimes. Has there been any media attention to this investigation? Charles asked. Not yet, Your Majesty, Tobias replied. The police have maintained absolute secrecy so far. But investigations of this magnitude are difficult to contain indefinitely. We estimate we may have days or weeks before the story breaks publicly. The king returned to his seat, his mind racing through scenarios and consequences. Each possible course of action seemed to lead to devastating outcomes for either Camilla personally, the monarchy as an institution, or both. I need to speak with Her Majesty directly, Charles decided. These decisions cannot be made without understanding exactly what she did and why. Sir Clive looked uncomfortable. Your Majesty, I should mention that the legal advisors have cautioned against discussions that could be seen as coordinating stories or obstructing justice. Any conversation with the Queen should probably include legal counsel. The suggestion that he couldn't speak freely with his own wife about a crisis threatening their family was another painful reminder of how serious the situation had become. 2 hours later, Charles found himself in the private sitting room at Clarence's house, facing Camilla across a small table laden with untouched tea service. She looked tired but defiant, her jaw set in the determined expression he had learned to recognize over their years together. I suppose you've been thoroughly briefed by now, Camilla said without preamble. The allegations are very serious, Charles replied carefully. I need to understand what really happened. Camilla's composure cracked slightly. What happened is that I got tired of watching people suffer while bureaucrats pushed papers around their desks. Do you know how long it takes for official aid to reach disaster victims in Commonwealth territories? Years, Charles. People die waiting for help that gets tangled up in red tape and political considerations. Charles had seen Camilla's passion for humanitarian causes firsthand. Her frustration with bureaucratic inefficiency was genuine and long-standing. But good intentions couldn't justify breaking the law. Tell me about the financial arrangements, Charles said. Camilla stood and began pacing, her agitation evident. Marcus came to me 2 years ago with a proposal. He had contacts in several Commonwealth territories who could distribute aid directly to families in need. The problem was getting money to them without it being intercepted by corrupt officials or lost in bureaucratic systems. Charles listened as his wife described a network that had evolved over time from a simple desire to help disaster victims into a sophisticated operation moving millions of pounds through multiple accounts and organizations. We weren't stealing the money for personal gain, Camilla insisted. Every penny went to people who desperately needed help. Yes, we circumvented official channels, but those channels were failing the people we were trying to help. But, you understand that what you did was illegal? Charles asked. Camilla stopped pacing and met his eyes. Of course I understand that. Eleanor made sure I understood the legal risks from the beginning. But sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking unjust laws. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Camilla providing details about the operation that made Charles realize the scope of her involvement was even greater than the briefings had suggested. She hadn't been a passive participant manipulated by others, she had been the driving force behind the entire network. What do you want to do now? Charles asked finally. Camilla was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady and resolved. "I want to take responsibility for what I did. I'm not ashamed of trying to help people, but I understand that I broke the law. If the monarchy is going to survive this, someone needs to be held accountable." Charles felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak at his wife's words. Her willingness to accept consequences for her actions showed the character that had made him love her, but it also meant she might be taken away from him just as he needed her support most. "The advisors think you might face prison time," Charles said quietly. "Then, that's what I'll face," Camilla replied. "But I won't let this destroy the monarchy. Too many people depend on the institution for me to put my personal comfort ahead of its survival." As Charles drove back to Buckingham Palace, he realized that the crisis was entering a new phase. Camilla was prepared to accept the legal consequences of her actions, but that decision would create new challenges for the monarchy and the government. The investigation would soon reach its conclusion, and the entire nation would learn that their queen consort was facing serious criminal charges. How the monarchy survived that revelation would depend on decisions that had to be made in the coming days. Charles had spent his life preparing for kingship, but nothing had prepared him for the possibility of watching his wife face prosecution for crimes motivated by the desire to help others. The crown had never felt heavier than it did that evening, as he contemplated a future that might include ruling without the woman who had become his closest partner and advisor. The crisis was no longer just about legal technicalities or constitutional precedents. It had become deeply personal, testing not only the monarchy's relationship with the law but also the bonds between two people who had found love later in life only to see it threatened by the consequences of compassion. The Old Bailey had witnessed countless historic trials, but never one quite like this. Queen Camilla sat in the dock with quiet dignity, her hands folded in her lap as the charges were read aloud. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had managed to secure seats through the lottery system established for this unprecedented case. Thomas Fletcher watched from the witness gallery, his testimony having been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. 6 months had passed since he first walked into Scotland Yard with his manila envelope of evidence, and the weight of his decision was still visible in his drawn features and nervous demeanor. The trial had captured international attention, with constitutional experts and legal scholars debating the implications for monarchies around the world. Could members of royal families be held accountable under the same laws that apply to ordinary citizens? The answer to that question would be determined in this London courtroom over the coming weeks. Sir Marcus Thornfield and Victoria Ashworth had already pleaded guilty to their roles in the financial network and were cooperating with authorities. Dr. Eleanor Sinclair had received a suspended sentence in exchange for her testimony about the legal advice she had provided. Queen Camilla alone had chosen to contest the charges, though her legal team was not arguing innocence but rather seeking to contextualize her actions within her humanitarian mission. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor David Stirling, had methodically presented evidence of the complex financial network that had moved over £30 million through unofficial channels over 3 years. Bank records, audio recordings, and documentary evidence painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that violated multiple laws regarding charity fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. "Your Honor," Stirling addressed Judge Patricia Henley, "this case is fundamentally about the rule of law. No individual, regardless of their position in society or their stated motivations, is above the legal framework that governs financial transactions and charitable activities. The defendant may have believed her intentions were noble, but the law does not provide exemptions for good intentions." The defense, led by renowned barrister Helena Richmond QC, had chosen a strategy that acknowledged the technical violations while emphasizing the humanitarian outcomes and the defendant's genuine commitment to helping vulnerable people. "Your Honor," Richmond argued, "my client stands before you as someone who saw suffering and acted to alleviate it when official channels failed. Yes, she operated outside legal frameworks, but she did so because those frameworks were themselves failing the people they were meant to protect. The money that moved through this network didn't line anyone's pockets, it rebuilt homes, provided medical care, and saved lives." The trial's most dramatic moment came when Queen Camilla herself took the stand. Speaking in clear, measured tones, she provided detailed testimony about her motivations and decision-making process. "I became aware through my official duties that disaster relief in Commonwealth territories was being delayed by bureaucratic processes that prioritized procedure over human welfare," she testified. I saw reports of families living in temporary shelters for years while paperwork moved slowly through various departments. I felt I had a moral obligation to act. Under cross-examination, Sterling pressed the Queen about her knowledge that her actions were illegal. You understood from the beginning that you were violating multiple laws, did you not? Sterling asked. I understood that I was operating outside official channels, Camilla replied carefully. I also understood that legal compliance was being prioritized over human welfare in ways that I found morally unacceptable. But, you knew you were breaking the law? Camilla paused before answering, the courtroom silent. Yes, I knew I was breaking the law. But, I also knew that following the law meant allowing preventable suffering to continue. The Queen's testimony revealed the depth of her involvement in the network and her complete understanding of the legal risks. She had not been manipulated or misled, she had made a conscious decision to prioritize humanitarian outcomes over legal compliance. Thomas Fletcher's testimony had been delivered 2 weeks earlier, and the emotional toll was evident as he recounted his decision to report the activities he had observed. Under questioning from the defense, he acknowledged his respect for Queen Camilla personally while maintaining that his duty to the law superseded personal loyalty. Mr. Fletcher, Richmond had asked, did you believe that the Queen's motivations were genuinely humanitarian? I did and still do believe that, ma'am, Thomas replied. But, good intentions don't justify breaking the law. If they did, anyone could claim noble motives to excuse criminal behavior. The prosecution had also called Dr. Patricia Hartwell, a former aid worker who had received funding through the Queen's network. Her testimony provided insight into the impact of the unofficial aid distribution. The money we received allowed us to provide immediate assistance to earthquake victims in Jamaica, Dr. Hartwell testified. Official aid channels would have taken 18 months to provide the same assistance. In that time, many of the families we helped would have lost their homes permanently or been forced to relocate. However, prosecution witnesses also included charity regulators who explained how the diversion of funds had actually harmed legitimate charitable work and created systems that could be exploited by less scrupulous individuals. The legal arguments extended far beyond the specific charges against Queen Camilla. Constitutional experts testified about the implications for royal immunity and the relationship between the monarchy and the law. Political scientists discussed the potential impact on public trust in royal institutions. Professor Margaret Thornton of Cambridge University, called as an expert witness by the prosecution, argued that prosecuting the Queen Consort was essential for maintaining the rule of law. If members of the royal family can claim exemption from legal consequences based on good intentions, she testified, then, we effectively have a two-tier justice system that undermines the fundamental principle that all citizens are equal under the law. The defense countered with Professor David Mills from Oxford, who argued that the unique constitutional position of royal family members required consideration of broader public interests. The defendant's actions were motivated by frustration with systemic failures in official aid distribution, he testified. Prosecuting her for attempting to address those failures sends a message that the law values procedural compliance over human welfare. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was deeply divided. Supporters gathered daily to show solidarity with Queen Camilla, arguing that her humanitarian motives should mitigate any legal consequences. Critics demanded equal treatment under the law, insisting that her royal status should not provide protection from criminal prosecution. King Charles maintained a careful public silence throughout the trial, though those close to him reported that the stress was taking a significant toll on his health and his ability to fulfill royal duties. The monarchy's approval ratings had fluctuated wildly as public opinion shifted based on daily testimony. Prime Minister David Cameron had also avoided commenting on the case, though government sources indicated that Downing Street was preparing for multiple scenarios depending on the trial's outcome. A conviction could trigger calls for broader reforms to royal immunity and the constitutional relationship between the monarchy and the law. The trial's final phase featured closing arguments that summarized months of complex evidence and testimony. Sterling emphasized the importance of legal accountability regardless of social position or stated motivations. This case will determine whether we live in a society where the law applies equally to all citizens or one where good intentions can excuse criminal behavior, Sterling told the jury. The defendant's humanitarian goals are admirable, but they cannot justify the systematic violation of laws designed to protect charitable funds and prevent financial crimes. Richmond's closing argument focused on the broader context of official failures in aid distribution and the defendant's genuine commitment to humanitarian principles. My client saw a choice between legal compliance and moral obligation, Richmond argued. She chose to help people rather than follow procedures that were failing those people. Yes, she broke technical laws, but she did so in service of higher moral principles that most of us would support. Judge Henley's instructions to the jury emphasized that they must focus on whether the legal elements of the charged crimes had been proven, regardless of their personal opinions about the defendant's motivations or the broader political implications. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. As the foreman stood to announce their decision, the courtroom fell completely silent. Thomas Fletcher felt his heart pounding as he waited to learn the consequences of his decision to report what he had witnessed. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty, the foreman announced. Camilla showed no visible reaction as the guilty verdicts continued for money laundering and tax evasion charges. She had prepared herself for this outcome and maintained her composure as Judge Henley scheduled sentencing for the following week. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Henley acknowledged the unique circumstances while emphasizing the importance of legal accountability. The defendant's humanitarian motivations are clear and genuine, Judge Henley stated. However, the law cannot provide exemptions based on good intentions, no matter how admirable. The systematic nature of these violations over several years requires a sentence that reflects the seriousness of the crimes while acknowledging the exceptional circumstances. Queen Camilla was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of serving half the sentence if she continued to cooperate with efforts to trace and return misappropriated funds. The sentence was significantly lighter than prosecution guidelines suggested, reflecting the judge's consideration of her motivations and cooperation. As court officers prepared to escort the Queen from the courtroom, she requested permission to make a brief statement. Judge Henley granted the unusual request. "I accept responsibility for my actions and the consequences that follow," Camilla said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "I hope that this case will lead to reforms that make official aid distribution more effective and responsive to human suffering. The families we helped deserved better from their governments, and I regret that trying to help them has created this constitutional crisis." Thomas Fletcher watched as Queen Camilla was led away, knowing that his testimony had contributed to this historic moment. The woman he had spent years protecting was now facing imprisonment because he had chosen duty to law over personal loyalty. In the days that followed, the constitutional implications of the conviction continued to reverberate. King Charles announced that the monarchy would undergo comprehensive reforms to ensure transparency in all royal charitable activities. Parliament began debating legislation to clarify the extent of royal immunity and establish clearer guidelines for royal involvement in charitable work. Public reaction remained divided, with some praising the equal application of justice while others criticized the prosecution of someone whose only crime was trying to help vulnerable people. International observers noted that the trial had demonstrated both the strength and the complexity of British constitutional democracy. Thomas Fletcher requested a transfer to different duties and eventually left royal service entirely. The weight of his decision never fully left him, though he remained convinced that upholding the law had been the correct choice. Years later, he would reflect that the case had proven that the rule of law was stronger than individual loyalties, even when those loyalties ran as deep as service to the crown. Queen Camilla served 18 months of her sentence before being released on parole. Her conviction led to significant reforms in both royal procedures and official aid distribution systems. The constitutional crisis she had inadvertently triggered ultimately strengthened democratic institutions by demonstrating that legal accountability applied to everyone, regardless of their position in society. The case became a landmark in constitutional law and a reminder that in a functioning democracy, good intentions could not excuse criminal behavior, no matter how noble the motivations or how elevated the social position of those involved. The Crown had faced judgment and been found accountable to the same laws that governed all citizens, proving that the rule of law was indeed supreme.